I gotta go. Good morning. Sorry for the delay. Okay, Hemshech Chaim Beis, the conclusion. In context of the Maamorim before, and we're in the middle of the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer. In Maamorei AdHamtz Bereishis Chanukah Maimer. And we're on page of 364, I believe. Let me find it. Sorry, 363. Sorry. 363. So the Maimer began on 361, and we're talking about Ner. The three aspects of a candle, the wick, and namely the wick and the oil, and their relationship with each other. In an elaborate fashion, the Mittler Rebbe explained, he said, L'cheira, why is the oil so critical, like we see in the halacha, in Bamem Adlikin, both by Ner Shabbos and Ner Chanukah, where it's a condition for the candle to be kosher, to be able to be Yetzer the mitzvah, you need to have oil, a proper oil that will be absorbed by the wick. Why is it so important, he says? The main thing is the wick burns, and that's that. So his answer is, just like you find, for example, you take a piece of wood, a dry piece of wood, you light it, you ignite it, and it burns. So it's true, the wick is not a piece of wood, but nevertheless, that should be the primary thing. So why? Dafka lamet tzarich sheyeh shemen nimshach b'psila dafka. V'im loy eina mitzvahs hadlaka klal. Not by Shabbos and not by Ner Chanukah. Why is that important? The oil seems to be secondary. It's fuel. You need it to fuel it. But why is it so primary? And he responds, he explains, because the Ikar Adlaka is b'shemen, because that's what causes it to burn properly. Adlaka does not mean just to light a flame for a second or a few seconds, to just flicker and burn out. Adlaka means something that burns consistently for a period of time and in a settled way. Like he says, the word Masha'er hu sheyev es Hashem b'sila machles ma'at ma'at zeu ikar sibus ikar v'adlaka at sheyichla Hashemen yichla adlaka v'apsila. In other words, the key is not just the igniting, lighting it, but it's to burn properly. And burning properly is after the shemen feeding the psila slowly. It absorbs, it draws from it, and the flame burns properly. That's what he says. Shenisheres kayem is built in the nefesh klal, and the psila itself remains intact. It's the oil that is getting consumed. So the real adlaka, the real burning, the real flame is actually coming from the oil, because the wick itself is only a conduit, like he says afterwards, a mamutza. Or we said machala. Hashemen. Hanivla b'psila, ma'at, ve'eina psila
Mechala es Hashem.
Yeah, Mechala es Hashem. And the psila is only a mamutza. The psila is necessary. We'll learn in a moment why. But the psila is a mamutza. So the real action is happening. The oil that's feeding it, and the production is the fire that's being produced by it. Yeah. And it's the oil that causes all this to happen. That's the fire. So that's why you need to have the shemen. That's why the shemen is not secondary, it's critical. That Hashem and Nisha b'psila der nimshach misyashiv v'sheiv umechala Mechala al Hashem sheba ma'at ma'at. And that's what causes to burn consistently, and yeah. And here he says explicitly, but when the shemen would, let's say the shemen as the din is, would not be drawn into the wick, what would happen? If you only had the wick and the fire, the fire would immediately jump and extinguish. Or completely consume the wick. So either the fire would just get extinguished or completely consume the wick immediately. On the other hand, a shemen without psila, without the psila, so it says the oir would not be able to draw from it. What would happen is it would either nishka, it would be drowned in it. It would basically be submerged in it, and it would burn out completely, immediately. When you have the psila like a conduit, a channel, like a wick that draws from the oil, and then the fire, you have everything you need to make the hadloka the right way. So, and slowly to burn properly. Nimse that the wick and the oil, that the air should be held on and contained. But the ikar hadloka is the shemen, and the shemen nimshach apsila is only like a mamutza. Yeah, and he repeats it again in different words, but the same idea. And then he says at the end, I'm reading on top of 363, ve'ein. Sorry. Additional point. So it's the consuming of the oil that causes the fire, not the consuming of the psila. The psila is not serving as fuel. That's not what you want. You don't want the psila to be burning. In a piece of wood, the dry wood, you only have two things. You have the dry wood and the fire. But here, you have the oil, the psila, the mamutza, and then the fire. And when the oil runs out, that's when the hadloka, that's when the fire burns out. And it's everything lefi erech liber hashemen. In other words, it's not the psila that determines the length of the burning of the fire, it's the amount of oil. And then he adds in the final parentheses one more connection, that it's also the purity and the clarity of the light is the fi erech the shemen. If the shemen, in other words, a very pure oil, the fire will burn in a much clearer and purer way. So again, you see, you see again from that the connection between the fire and the oil. So though the wick is necessary, but you come away from here how much the shemen is so important in this process. And now we'll learn what it's like in the nimshal, the moral that he applies with nefesh alikis and nefesh abamis. That's what we're going to learn now. Okay, that sums up what we learned yesterday, and we continue on unless someone has any questions. And as often is the case, as we learn it in the nimshal, sometimes we understand the mashal even better too. So let's see how he goes here. So we're on top of the new paragraph on page 363. The pages can be found at ayinbeis.com, or if you follow, or you can see it in the group, the WhatsApp group that we have. And now, hanimshal mekolzeh. This is all the mashal, the example. What's the nimshal from all of this? All these details. What's the moral? What do we learn from all this in the subject matter? Remember, the whole thing was to explain ner Hashem nishmas adam, how neshama works. So we understand how a ner works, the mashal, the candle. But how does it now work in the neshama? And the same thing later we'll learn how it works in the mitzvah, ner mitzvah. So he says, Yuvan beruchnius, nimshal mekolzeh Yuvan beruchnius beinyan haneshama lekish shenikra ner havaya. We'll understand from this mashal and its details, we'll understand how it is spiritually. In the matter of the neshama, the divine soul, that's called Ner Hashem, Ner Havaya, Nishmas Adam. So whatever we learn now about the Ner, we're now going to apply why the Pasuk calls it a Ner, because we can learn from what we just, these details, we can learn how a neshama works. Which again, I'm emphasizing how a Moshe Chassidus is so critical, because it not only gives us an explanation, it gives us something tangible in this world. You could say maybe that's why God created candles, in order to teach us about something far more ethereal that's abstract, like a soul. Nobody's seen a soul, but we see a candle. And as we study a candle and evaluate and explore and dissect the anatomy of the candle, that in turn helps us from the physical world to understand how the neshama works. The Beis Dvarim Halolu Shabeneir. These two things in the candle that we talked about, the shemen and the psila, shemen and psila, the oil and the wick. Hine hapsila hu aneshama elakis. So now he's going to explain what is that in the nimshal. So he says the wick is the divine soul. V'ashemen hu nefesh hativis, and the shemen is the natural soul. So here he's calling it by natural, divine neshama elakis and nefesh hativis. I don't know why, but why doesn't he say nefesh elakis, nefesh habamis, or nefesh elakis, nefesh hativis? That's what he calls it. Maybe because the pasuk says Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam, but in Torah he did use the word nefesh elakis, nefesh habamis, or nefesh hativis. They're pretty interchangeable for all practical purposes. So I don't think it's important to try to analyze why he uses this expression. I think the Rebbe, Mittler Rebbe himself, is going to use different terms as we discussed. We learn nefesh hasichlis, nefesh hativis, nefesh achiyunis, and nefesh habamis. They're all correct words. And each one a little different emphasis, but they're more or less the same category. Bottom line is, we're talking about two nefashis here: the neshama lekis and the nefesh hativis. Just for the record, nefesh is usually nehi, and neshama is usually moichin. Nefesh, ruach, neshama. So nefesh is usually nehi, like the more behavioral. Ruach is the midas, and neshama is usually the moichin, the chabad. But I don't know if that's what he means here, because the nefesh halikis is controlled by the mind. But I just wanted to point that out. Okay, nefesh hativis. Vashemen. Now that we know what the nimshal is, so again, psila, the divine soul, shemen, the animal, the natural soul, he calls it. So he says like this: Vashemen hu nimshach acher psila. Like he said, which is necessary. That the shemen is critical, that it should flow, it should follow. Nimshach means it is drawn. The psila, that's exactly how it works. Like we talked about, the psila has the right properties to draw the oil within it, and the oil has the right properties to be drawn. If somewhere there's some type of malfunction there, or the material of the wick, or the quality of the oil, the what do we call it? The quality, not the standards, the grade. The grade of the oil is not proper, it's going to affect that flow. So the key is the shemen should be nimshach acher apsila. V'kola ba'oyer halakis, and then would be consumed in the fire, the divine fire that's being produced by this combination. So the key is like this: the psila, divine soul, the natural soul, should be drawn into the divine soul and produce and be consumed by the fire, the divine fire that this is creating. Al yedei hapsila, through the erakil, which is coming through the wick. Because like we said, the oil is nechaz, the fire in the psila, not in the oil. It's being fed from the oil, but it's nechaz. Where is it contained? Where is it being held? If you look at it, the flame is not burning inside the keli where the oil is. If you look at it closely, the flame is burning through the wick. So it's al yedei psila, shehu nefesh halikis, which is referring to the divine soul. Now he does use the word nefesh halikis. Shehu b'chinas mamutza, which serves as an interface, as an in-between, lahavi, to bring, ulechaber, and to connect, oyer eliki, the divine fire, b'nefesh hativis, into the natural soul. So there you have the structure of how, the dynamics of how it works, and how each piece is doing its part. So here clearly, yesterday the question was asked, who ignites the fire in the first place? It's pretty clear that the Nefesh Elikis has natural fire. Like he says in Tanya, the Eishal Neir Hashem Nishmasad means when you're born with a neshama, you have a pilot flame burning inside you. It does not have to be ignited. It has to be fanned and it has to be expressed. But the neshama itself is a fiery entity. Now the psila, you could say, one second, the psila itself is not fiery. It's once there's a fire, it's holding on into the psila. But the nimshal apparently, Ner Hashem Nishmasada means the psila is the one that is carrying a fire with it. But however, from the psila alone, it's a very small fire and a very quick burning fire. It wouldn't last. That's why the shemen is so critical to feed it and to be drawn into it. Just spelling it out a bit more. Okay. That's how he describes the parts here. So we have here the shemen, the psila, and the oir eliki. Good. Any questions about this? Remember, this is going to be a longer discussion, so it's not finished. He's just laying out the groundwork here. Now he adds something we learned in Torah to the parentheses. Now that the root, where is this Shem is rooted?
You're not coming in very clearly.
The root of the nefesh. Okay. Tell me if it clears up.
Or maybe just keep going. It seems to come in and out, but
Shesharsha, the root of the nefesh hativis is rooted mepchinas hatoyu, the world of toyu. Like we learned, if you learn by nefesh habamid, nefesh hativis, in Torah, he spoke about toyu. That's why it's intense energy. It's just not balanced. It's not harmonious energy. Just to go back and refer to the Torah, let me see exactly where it was. We spoke about why. Yeah, top of 39C. So he spoke. Hashem and Anim Shchach Lapsilu who are said from he betayu, yeah. L'mayla, yeah. In other words, the Wick, it comes from Elam Atikun, the Nefesh Elikis. Like we say in the beginning of Torah, second pasuk. It says, so he says, Toyu is a world called Cheshach, darkness. So the goal here is like this. The Nefesh HaTivis itself is rooted in Toyu, which is dark. And the goal here, the Nefesh the Psila, the Nefesh, it takes the divine soul, connects the divine fire with the Nefesh HaTivis, that's lahafich la'oir ayidei shema the neshama. So you're taking the Nefesh HaTivis, which is rooted in the darkness of Toyu, to transform it to light, to flame, through what? The shema of the neshama. The Nefesh HaTivis is ban, shem ban, like we learned at the bottom of page 39D, Bahamis, and that's a dark state. Shema of the neshama is the wick that connects the divine fire to the Nefesh HaTivis, ki yadua. The ma mevara leban. The ma refines ban. Ma is gematria Adam, Tikkun. Ban is gematria behema Toyu, and ma refines it, means that it harnesses it and channels it to become part of the divine fire, feed the divine fire that is this Eir Havayim. Okay, Eir Eliki. Yeah. Ukemavur b'moshla hanal, as was explained before in the analogy and the example, mamish. In other words, exactly these details, exactly this way as it works in the moshel. We explained it in the moshel mamish, exactly how it is. Vidal, Vidai lemevin. It's an expression the Mittler Rebbe uses. Remember, the Mittler Rebbe is bina, so dai lemevin, bina. It's enough for those for the discerning one, for the one that has bina. This is enough said, basically. Okay, so he laid out the pieces. Now, Ulahav and Bir Kolzeh. How's the connection? It's been smooth since? Yeah?
Yeah, it's much better now. It's much better.
Okay, good. Ulahav and Bir Kolzeh. And to understand the explanation of all this, Yesh lahagdim tchila, we need to first preface Shedish hanefesh shalikiz benefesh habams, the root of the divine soul and the animal soul. As you can see already, the style of the Mittler Rebbe, how different it is from the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe is every more Nekudis, the main points, and the Mittler Rebbe has this harchava, this expansiveness. But it follows exactly the same order of the beginning of Torah that we learned on page, where it began on page 38b. Then I was going to explain the difference between the divine soul and the animal soul, the root and the difference between the two. Shabalashna Gemara, interesting language of Gemara, he says, these two, the divine soul and the animal soul, nikraim yetzer tev v'yetzer hara. The good inclination, yetzer, the good side, the yetzer hara, the bad side, the evil inclination. Shabbat tzadikim, the Gemara calls it, when this is using the same Gemara in Nida, I think in the Gemara in Nida, where he talks about in Tanya. So what do we find about Yetzer Tev, Yetzer Hara? Shabbat Tzadikim Yetzer Tev Shefton, Ubi Rashaim Yetzer Hara Shefton. Actually, no, it's not the Gemara in Nida. I see below, he says it's the Gemara in Brachas. Fine. Tzadikim, the good inclination, dominates. Shefton is its judge, governs it. Over the Shayim, the animals, the Yetzirah, the evil inclination, Shefton governs. In Tani, he calls it Shefton is not governing; it's more saying an opinion, and the Shelton would be control. But he's not going to that dig. Bottom line is, who is the main voice? By the tzaddik, it's the Yetzer Hara is the voice, and by the Rosh, it's the Yetzer Hara. Ubeinenim zeh v'zeh shefton, and in a beineni, you have both. Zeh v'zeh. In Tanya, he explains in detail, but basically in the Gemara, you have both voices. The question is who's going to win, but that's not discussed here. So what he's saying here is that the nefesh alekis, nefesh abamis that I just mentioned in the lashon of the Gemara, Yetzer Teiv and Yetzer Hara. If you remember, in Torah he explains that's the midas of the nefesh alekis and the midas of the nefesh abamis. We're going to get there, but that's how he's saying it here. The mashma,
like the Tanya, it's, or just whoever has more good than bad.
Either way, he's not getting into the details of it. He's just stating the point here is just to make that the name for Nefesh Elokis, Nefesh Abamis in the Gemara is Yetzer Tev and Yetzer Hara. He's not going into that discussion, but obviously the Tanya explains it in detail. It's not relevant here. The mashma, it appears, Shebeza Nefoshes, Shenikraim Nefesh Elokis and Nefesh Abamis, Sheltes, that both souls, Sheltes, rule, govern. Like he says in Zohar and in Eitz Chaim. Well, the pomim is gaber chinas hatev the Eitz hatev. I mean, he was actually explaining it in a very simple way, not the way it's in Tanya, actually, now that I'm reading it. And so he says like this, at times, the good of the Yetzer Tev dominates or is overpowering. Well, the pomim is gaber b'chinas hadad Yetzer Hara, and sometimes the evil of the evil inclination dominates. The gever love, and overpowers him and controls him. Like the pasuk says, Yetzer Leva Adam, that the inclination of a person in the heart of the person is Ra min Urav. From childhood, he has a selfish inclination. Ra. Umizgaber alav b'chol yem. And it dominates over him, and that power that controls, overpowers, or dominates over him every day. And below in the footnote, they quote the Gemara, they cite the Gemara in Sukkot. So in answer to your question, here he seems to not be talking about how the Tanya explains it. Just talking on basic level that you have these voices. Yetzer Tov, Yetzer Hara. By Tzadi, Yetzer Tov is the voice that controls him or dominates him. Yetzer Hara, the Arashayim is the Yetzer Hara, and by Beini you have both voices, and sometimes this one is strong, more powerful, this one. But it's still, the Tanya adds that even though you have a Nefesh Habamis Beini, he doesn't affect his thought, speech, and action. He's not going there. He's just saying Mizgaber could be, the Nefesh Habamis could be very powerful in a Beinani, you just don't act on it. So you're not getting into those details. But you have basically these scenarios. Okay. V'chol ikar, Yedidus HaNefesh Al-Kis, and the primary, and the Chol Ikar. I know Ikar sounds like primary, and Chol means completely, exclusively. But Chol Ikar means that the entire purpose of the soul, of the divine soul's descent below, Shehu Yetzer Tov B'Adam, which in the person, the language of Gemara is the Yetzer Tov in the person, the good inclination. What's the purpose of this descent below? Till now he hasn't been talking about how it is, but he just said there's two forces. So he says its purpose is Einei Rak. It's nothing but Levarer Liyetzer Hara. That's why the neshama comes down, to refine, to clarify, separate and clarify and refine the evil inclination. Shehu Aguf, that's the body, Shenikra Nefesh HaTivis, called Nefesh HaTivis. So you see here how he's using all these terms. Nefesh Habamis, now the Nefesh HaTivis, Yetzer Hara. So it all comes down, and now he calls the Guf the Nikra Nefesh HaTivis. Ulahavche L'Gdusha Ha'elakis. That's the entire purpose, to come refine the negative, the evil inclination, which is the body, the natural soul, and to transform it to holiness, to divine holiness. L'Gdusha Ha'elakis. You'll say, one second, doesn't it say in some places that the neshama also benefits? So that's a different story. So he explains in the parentheses, Kan neshama atzma ain't sorach tikkun. He says in Tanya, neshama itself doesn't need tikkun. A neshama is a divine soul. It's completely intact. It doesn't mean it doesn't gain from coming down. As we're going to learn later, b'chol moedecha, we learned in Torah that the neshama lekis also will grow. But that's not the purpose. The purpose came down because the neshama itself doesn't not tikkun. In Gan Eden, it's doing its job completely. Because the neshama comes from the world of tikkun. Shehu shema, that's the shema, like we'd mentioned before in the previous parentheses. Shemipnei zeh nikra ner havaya, and because of that, it's called ner Hashem, ner havaya. And therefore, it does not need tikkun itself. It's already ner havaya, nishmas adam. So then, why does the neshama come down below? Only to clarify and to separate and reform and refine the klippas nega, the transparent, the bright klippa, which is a klippa of the nefesh hativis, of the natural soul below. Okay. V'zeu she'emrim b'chol, v'zeu she'omar, or she'emrim b'chol levovcha, b'shnei yitzarecha. And that's what it means when we say after the Shema, v'ahavtas Hashem lekecha, b'chol levovcha, with all your heart, What does the Gemara say? Levavcha with two bays, not libcha, b'shnei yitzarecha, with both sides, yetzer tev and yetzer hara. Afilu b'yetzer hara, that afilu in the yetzer hara, the evil inclination, shu nefesh ativis, which is the natural soul, that the goal is li'kafya l'rasha b'klipas nega, to restrain the ra in the klipas nega shenikra sitra achra, that's called the other side, sheyeh gam alev achumri, that also the very physical, the very material, we call even the crass heart, batul v'nichna lelakus, is subjugated, is humbled, is v'nichna, and same idea, batul v'nichna, achna, subjugated, lelakus, to godliness, tamid, constantly, be spileless ava v'yira, with a excitable love and reverence, v'tshuva maisim tevim, and tshuva maisim tevim, which is only in this world, v'lo yelach b'shiras li behara, and shouldn't follow its own selfish or evil inclinations of the heart, whatever the heart desires. It shouldn't follow the heart's whims, evil whims. So that's the purpose. So nefesh alakis, the nefesh comes down, the neshama, not for itself, to enter and to engage with the animal soul and subdue it, restrain it, and ultimately transform it to have a spilus of aviyira and not follow its own desires, its own proclivities. Okay. And more or less, with some additional points, this is more or less what we learned in the Alter Rebbe's Maimer. And I think it's pretty clear, but just in case if somebody wants me to clarify anything, please.
I have a question. And his point that the entire purpose of the neshama coming down into the body is to essentially refine the nefesh Bahamas, the animalistic qualities of the human. But in that, he's also saying that the neshama itself is perfect in a sense. But I'm just wondering, relative to other, I don't know, understandings in Judaism, where we say, we, for example, believe in reincarnation, Gilgalim, and recycling of souls, if you will, because the neshama has work to do down here. And I've always heard it as a matter of the neshama needs a tikkun, and sometimes, like a little baby, God forbid, comes into the world briefly, it leaves very soon, it dies. So they say, well, that neshama just had a tiny little tikkun, just needed a little small adjustment, and then it went back to a higher place in higher worlds. So I'm a little confused by the seeming disparity between those two concepts.
So first of all, this is not Mittler Rebbe's original idea. In Tanya, he says it explicitly in Perek Lamed Zayin that the soul did not come down for itself, because the soul is a divine soul. It doesn't need anything in this world. Once it comes, the soul can benefit and achieves great things that it cannot achieve in Gan Eden. That's correct. You read it Sherech Aliyah. But this, so that's, there's a second track in some that talk about what the soul, that the soul's strengths and abilities get actualized when it's challenged. So it comes into this world, like you say, because the challenges of this world will bring out strengths from the soul that would not brought out when it's in heaven. With all the examples of the king's child, while he's all in the palace, doesn't have to work hard, everything is provided for him. Where in this world the soul has to struggle, so we'll bring out deeper strengths. But then, so what is explained is that there's two elements to it. One is the soul's primary goal is to come down to refine the animal soul, to refine the world. And then there's a second thing, that the soul benefits from that process and indeed grows in ways it can never grow. Like even in Torah, even here we learned that that the animal soul ultimately adds a whole level of bligvul, because the soul itself is like a wick, and it's only gvul, if you remember, mamala kalam. So number one is, the first point I'm making is there are different aspects to it, and they're not a contradiction, they're different functions. And the question of primary or secondary reasons. As far as Gilgul goes, you could argue that the soul didn't finish the job down here. It's not that the soul is not complete. It's that the soul that was sent down here for a purpose to refine the animal soul didn't finish refining it. You know, let's say a soul comes down to do a favor for a certain person, and they didn't end up doing the favor, or ended up doing something that caused damage. So the source to the soul's completion is for the soul's mission's completion. No, it's the same soul that comes down here for the nefesh habamis. If it didn't do the job, it has to come down again to finish that job. So it's not about the soul, it's about his job. Those are the 2 points I would make.
Excellent. Thank you very much. That was very helpful.
So
Rabbi
is the
Jacobson,
only...
does it? Oh, I'm sorry.
No, you go.
Rabbi Jacobson, does that also mean that in Shamayim, the animal soul is also existing in the Olam Haba?
Not that I know of.
So it's only when the soul comes down.
It has a root in Olam Haba. We learned that the animal soul is rooted, if you remember, in the Malachim, in the angels, and it has a root. I mean, it has a root in Olam HaTeyu. Is Teyu called Olam Haba? No, but it's rooted in spiritual levels, the animal soul, if that's what you're asking.
Thank you.
So is the only way that the soul can go higher by refining the nefesh habehemis, or is there? I mean, is that the whole point of the soul coming down here?
In heaven, a soul climbs, but it's all relative. It's like you go from one level, but it's not a paradigm shift. If you want the soul, and a big part of Ayin Beis, if you remember, was when the soul comes down below, it's a far more diminished than it is in its source. So, if you want a soul to fully experience the divine essence, not Giluyim, not the revelations, in Gan Eden it learns Torah, and we learned, if you remember, there was a whole section he learned about the Av and V'yir. It has love, but it's contained love. It's limited, it's finite love. For the soul to experience a paradigm shift, it has to go through a paradigm shift. So it has to come down to actually a hostile world. You know, we just read last week's Parsha. Where does Yaakov build his family? Not in Israel, not in Beersheba, in Haran, in the wrath of God, in a dark world. So darkness is you get out, as the soul gets out of its comfort zone, it can reach places that are beyond its comfort zone, if you want to put it in different terms. So the answer is yes. For a paradigm shift, does not mean a soul cannot grow in its own environment. You know, think of a student in yeshiva. He can study in yeshiva and he can learn and he grows and he becomes smarter and more knowledgeable and more brilliant. But then take him out of the yeshiva environment and thrust him into a world, a hostile world, where he has to deal with people who are either ignorant or argumentative or have different opinions, and now he has to deal with all that. What will happen? Now he's going to have to dig a lot deeper and find much more powerful resources. That's just a simple example, but essentially the same idea with Golus. Everything we learn in Chassidus about going into a darker place that leads you to a higher place is essentially this idea. So the neshama itself does not need it, so to speak, for its own. It's a let's call it. It's a functional, healthy entity, a soul. But then a person goes through trauma and goes through dysfunctionality, which is painful. What happens? Ultimately, that can lead the person to a far more refined place that the soul, a healthy soul, will never have. So no one wants that. But once it happens, it can catapult you to a whole different dimension. So basically, you look at it like life, the pains of life that bring things. But the soul doesn't come down here to take care of itself. It comes down to deal with the dark world. And then in turn, it will benefit from that.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Yeah, for sure. Good. So, I think we'll stop here. Because now he's going to ask the question, actually, the same question asked in Torah Eir and in Ayin Beis. This is one of the places where the Ayin Beis asks the question, does not answer it, but in Torah Eir, the Maamorei Alter Rebbe and Mittler Rebbe, they do answer it, and we already discussed this. The question is going to be, and we'll learn that, not tomorrow, we'll learn that on Monday. He's going to talk about, just to give you the next section, he says, the next thing he says, where's the neshama have the power to transform this dark soul, this dark animal soul, this evil inclination? How do you do that when the whole evil inclination is driven for its own self-interest? And that's going to be the beginning of the process of Shema, of how the neshama ultimately influences the animal soul, as he explained. And this was a big part of how the Rebbe Rashab finishes Ayin Beis with that question, but then he never gets back to the question. So this next section is very much part of that sequence in this narrative. Okay, so we'll stop here right before that question, pretty much close to the bottom of page 363, and we'll stop here. Anybody want to ask anything about this, or? Okay.